Thanks so much for joining us on Morning Live Sport. On this day, the 11th of April 2001, 24 years ago, Orlando Pirates and Kaizer Chiefs faced off at Ellis Park Stadium in a midweek Soweto Derby. While both Pirates and Chiefs were chasing the league title, and this was a game everyone didn't want to miss. Football fans and organisers were anticipating the clash, but little did they know that 43 people would lose their lives just barely 20 minutes into the encounter. The Ellis Park Stadium was packed, with reports suggesting 60,000 spectators were at the venue, and there were tons of thousands of spectators outside the Ellis Park Stadium. The game still went ahead despite the red flags. Well, Chiefs opened the scoring through Tony Ilodigwe's goal in the 15th minute to become the first Nigerian player to score in the Soweto Derby for the club. Meanwhile, those outside the venue forced their way in by pushing and shoving security guards in order to celebrate with those inside. Well, Benedict Vilakazi equalized for the Buccaneers in the 17th minute, and the goal broke the camel's back as the security lost control of the situation and many flooded into the stadium. With capacity limited and a loss of security control, the game had to be stopped as chaos had already ensued within the Ellis Park Stadium itself. After hours of trying to calm the situation, sadly, 43 fans were declared dead in what remains the biggest disaster to have ever happened in the history of South African football. So it has been an eventful week on and off the field, and as we look ahead to the sporting action happening this weekend, one has to get some context into the matters that are unfolding in front of our eyes, and sports fans are looking forward to the action that will take place this weekend. So to talk about this, we have invited into studio News 24 senior sport writer who also doubles up as a commentator and an analyst, and that is Kanyiso Tswaku. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, just looking at that sad story of the Ellis Park disaster, and obviously we've seen the violence that's taken place in South African football in the last 2 weeks. I mean, just what are your thoughts there, Kanyiso? How do we get the situation under control?
Good morning, Stacey, and good morning to the viewers. I think crowd behaviours and crowd culture needs to be addressed. I remember that game quite well. I was actually still in primary school, but it was a midweek game. It actually it was a tragedy that unfolded in front of our eyes, similar to the experience that English football fans had with Hillsborough 1989. One, it was avoidable. Two, it remains avoidable. Remember that we never did have a similar issue, but if you remember what transpired at the Soweto Derby with the fake tickets issue where the ground was oversubscribed, there was issues with parking, and you could sense that the ground was just 2-3 minutes away from disaster. It's a good thing that Stadium Management South Africa, through Bert Grobela, the CEO, have gone to lengths to try to avoid and avert what transpired in the Derby earlier this year. The 3rd of May, when Pirates and Chiefs meet again, is again going to be an acid test of whether the systems that they have in place will be foolproof and actually help avoid a repeat. Not a repeat, but you don't want to see something like what happened at Ellis Park, but clearly with FNB Stadium being oversubscribed at the top because of the issue of fake tickets and people who are still outside the ground and able to access, it was a small recipe for disaster. And I think now, quickly, lessons were learned from that particular game. One of them being that tickets will stop being sold outside the grounds. They were made available elsewhere. Once they were sold out, they were sold out. But again, there is a stadium culture that, especially football fans, also need to just teach themselves, like getting to games on time, understanding that if you don't have a ticket, you don't have a game, and also ensuring that security guards in particular understand the job that they're there to do.
Yeah. And also, I think when we saw the violence between Orlando Pirates and MCLJ, the players themselves, I think perhaps the players and the organisers and teams need to understand that they set the precedent for their culture. I know Jose Rivera is saying that it's completely unacceptable, but it is something that the actual squad needs to be cognizant of.
Look, it is unfortunate that that kind of violence we saw, and it's not trying to absolve Mamelodi Sundowns, more Pirates. Well, Sundowns were the first victims last week at Loftus Versfeld. It is uncommon to South African football. You hardly see players and officials fight the referee at the end of domestic or cup games here in South Africa. There will be that odd squabble here and there, but what transpired at the Orlando Stadium is un-South African. It doesn't often happen here. You saw with Esperance fans who were taunting the Sundowns fans, and then when the violence got out of hand, the Esperance were quick to put up their hands and try to blame Mamelodi Sundowns. In Wednesday's case, it was very clear who the instigators were. It was MC Alger. They started fighting amongst themselves and the police. That was in the crowd, and that was during the game. And then it became very clear towards the end of the game that they weren't quite accepting of the result. One of the key things that Jose Riviero said at yesterday's Nedbank Cup semi-final press conference was that you need to learn how to win, you need to learn how to lose, and you also need to learn how to accept the result for what it is. And I think with the North African teams, they've got to a point where they kind of find it difficult to accept a result. I mean, if you look at how Pyramids beat AS4 and then AS4 at the end of the game, you could see how distraught they were. But again, it just boils down to the fact that as much as there's a lot at stake, it still remains a game of football. But then again, in some countries, football is a bit more than life and death.
I know it's an emotionally charged thing. We understand that. But as you say, it's about changing that culture overall. And it's not common, as you mentioned, to South Africa. Let's move on to the Amajimbos. Unfortunately, they find themselves out of the competition, but let's chat about the exciting prospects that there are for future Bafana teams as well, or for a future Bafana squad.
Look, it's boding well. It's boding well for future South African football. I think the key part is now how do they actually take forward that group of players. Remember that if you go back to the 2009 Under 20 World Cup, where a Bafana core was built around that team, even though it wasn't quite well utilized for the following year's World Cup. But I think it just becomes important now for the work that Vela Kumalo has done to be built on. I mean, already Raymond Mtaka has picked his under 20 AFCON side. Hopefully they also do the same, because if we now find ourselves in a position where we've got an under 17 team going to a World Cup and an under 20 team going to a World Cup, and with Bafana doing well, and that's in spite of the issues that the South African Football Association faces, especially off the field. It's a very, very big fillip for South African football, where you've got two age group teams and the main senior national team. And that's notwithstanding that we've got the women's team that is doing ever so well from a continental perspective.
Why do you think the transition is not always as strong as it should be?
Look, there's always the gap between age group football and club football. I mean, rugby is not immune to this. We would have seen how well our young players play at school level and at early age group level. But that step from being under 20 through to being a senior player, is quite even the move from being a primary high school player to under 20 is a very big step. When you move from under 20 and you move through to seniors, it's actually quite a big step. I think that's where the importance of how the PSL, the Reserve League, and the Motsepe Foundation Championship, when you look at the PSL, that being the Betway Premiership and the Motsepe Foundation Championship, how they help bridge the gap. Because yes, you understand what the imperatives are for a professional league, but also on the other hand, there's also the need to ensure that whatever talent that is pushed through from the junior age group levels is then delicately yet also deliberately infused into the club setup, and then hopefully the more talented players are now able to go play overseas. Because as much as our league has come on in leaps and bounds, it becomes very important that our players get exposed to football overseas.
I have to ask you to wrap up, but before you go, I mean, Nedbank Cup, let's talk about that quickly before you leave.
Interesting set of games, interesting set of times. 3 p.m. Marumo Gallants and Orlando Pirates, 6 p.m. Sundowns and Chiefs. I don't think we've ever had a session where we've had two big cup semi-finals, so fans will be spoiled for choice. Look, I'm not even good at putting up results. So let's just hope that this weekend again we get something similar to the quality of football that we've seen over the past two CAF match weeks.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and providing such insightful thoughts there around South African football, and then giving us a preview into the weekend. We've been chatting to sports commentator and analyst Kanyiso Twaku. And that's it for your sports news for this hour.